A very good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the ISAS seminar titled The US Presidential Election and Its Impact on India-US Trade. Dr. Badrinarayanan Gopalakrishnan, Fellow and former Head Trade and Commerce, Niti Aayog, Government of India, is the guest speaker for the day. Dr. Amitendu Palit, Senior Research Fellow and Research Lead, Trade and Economics at ISAS, will be chairing the seminar. A gentle reminder to keep your electronic devices on silent mode. We are pleased to inform you that today's seminar is being live streamed on ISAS's Facebook page. I shall now hand over the floor to Dr. Palit. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Divya, and welcome everybody to today's seminar on the US presidential election and its impact on the India-US trade. I know it's a Friday afternoon, but Friday afternoon not the best times for holding a lecture, and that too a seminar on the US presidential election and its impact on India-US trade. But it's a testimony, I think, to the general interest in the subject and also in what we can expect to hear from our guest speaker today, that this is a full room at this point in time. Well, I think I'll just very briefly introduce the subject and bring in the context of why the US presidential elections do have a significance for the India-US trade relationship specifically and the wider economic relationship. When Donald Trump was the president of the United States, and that was a fairly turbulent time in many respects, the India-US trade relationship also went through certain unusual ups and downs. It's not that the India-US relationship has always been a particularly harmonious one, because much as the United States is one of India's largest trade partners, the number one rank keeps getting swept with China as and when the volumes go up and down. But there are other parts of the trade relationship which are pretty frictional. So for example, India has constantly been on the watch list for intellectual property violations and IPR malfunction protection systems in the special and the Super 301 reports. There have been a number of instances where the United States and India have been in disputes at the WTO. A lot of those disputes are pending between them bilaterally as well as with other partners. And on trade, the worldviews of the two countries have by and large been quite different on a number of areas. But having said that, this is one trade relationship which is very, very significant for India, because the United States is India's largest export market. While it really doesn't matter that much, India holds a surplus, a goods trade surplus with the United States, which makes a difference insofar as its larger trade profile and trade balance and the rest of it is concerned. When Donald Trump exited office, I think India and the US were pretty close to doing a free trade agreement. It didn't materialize, but that was surprising because the Donald Trump presidency began with a lot of upheavals. India was one of the countries which was famously described by him as tariff king. And there was this issue over the Harley-Davidson motorcycles and motorbikes and so on and so forth. And ultimately, when he moved out, that was a point in time when some sort of equilibrium had been achieved between the two countries. This might have been due to the fact that for Donald Trump, every trade partner was exclusive of the other, and there was a clearly transactional approach in going ahead on all trade relationships. But subsequently, when the next administration came, and the current one that continues, we haven't seen discord in the trade relationship. In fact, there have been fairly amicable, low-profile, quiet, behind-the-scenes resolution of a number of outstanding disputes that India and the United States had on trade. So one sees the number of disputes at the WTO recorded in terms of both countries having dramatically come down. But where there has been another important implication outside the bilateral sphere is obviously the strategic part of the India-US relationship. And today, I think India's interest in looking at who comes into the White House is not just because of what it means for its bilateral trade relations with the United States, but also because what does a new US president mean for the rest of the world? And how does it affect India's engagement with those countries? Because there's clearly going to be an implication of that. And there are a large variety of initiatives, and I'm sure Badri is going to take us through them, in areas of critical and emerging technologies, semiconductors, critical minerals, movement of people, engineering and goods, where India and the US have actually crossed the baseline level of collaboration, and they're pretty much into an active, meaningful, long-term looking collaboration. They're into important groups like the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. They are working together in the Quad. They're also part of the Minerals Security Partnership and various other initiatives, multi-country and global. So the United States clearly looks at India with a certain worldview. India looks at the US with a certain worldview. And in between those worldviews, there is the world of trade. So which gets cut across, compacted, implicated, impacted in various ways by these relationships. And it's a very fast changing world. So there's quite a lot of unexpected, as we say in economic terms, exogenous developments that are expected to impact the relationship as we go ahead. So I think both in terms of a Republican presidency, or more specifically a Donald Trump comeback to the White House, or in terms of a Harris presidency, there are various kinds of expectations that the Indian trade establishment would have with respect to a new president in the White House. I will not go into this subject anymore, but I think what I'll do is I'll very briefly talk about the speaker that we have with us today. But I'm saying here after more than 20 years. So there was a point in time when we were colleagues together at the Indian Council for Research in International Economic Relations, in short, ICRIER, in Delhi. We had very distinguished colleagues, Mrs. Ishar Aluwalia and Dr. Rajiv Kumar, and a large number of, I think, celebrated major economists of India who were our colleagues at that point in time. We have learned a lot of their trade in a broad sense now, while working with them. And Badri moved on to do his postdoctoral studies in Purdue University after having finished a PhD at IGIDR in Bombay. He went to Purdue, started working there, did very well for himself, and then moved to the state of Washington. So he has been based in Seattle. He's been into economic consultancy, and he has also been actively engaged in a large number of other roles, advisory roles, with various governments, various organizations, and his latest role was with the Niti Aayog in India, where he headed the trade vertical. So he's as fresh from the policy conversation as one can catch anybody in that respect. So Badri, welcome to Singapore. Thank you so much. Great pleasure to see you here after years altogether. You haven't changed much. And I look forward to hearing from you, as we all do. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Amityendu. Really wonderful to see you after a long time, and thanks for the generous introduction. And you have given more insights than what I was thinking of giving from this.
I didn't intend to.
Discussion. So, but thanks a lot. I'm really, it's an honor and privilege to be here. This is my first visit to Singapore, and obviously first visit to NUS and ISAS as well. So thank you very much for hosting me. So this topic was, I should just mention to begin with that this topic was not one that I chose. It was given to me by Amityendu to ensure that we have enough interest. And so when the topic was given to me, but I was quite excited too, because I've been based in the US for around 2 decades now, and been in the Indian government recently. So I thought I can connect some dots and do some analytics, which is my main area of focus. So I converted this difficult question into a series of analytical exercises, and that's what I'm going to discuss today. So, as Amitendra already mentioned, it's a very interesting times, both in the US and in India when it comes to trade. At a very high level, US as a country has started, talking the language of what other countries used to talk earlier, protectionism, with some fancier terms like resilience and so on. So the tariff hikes, tariff increases, and some of these protectionist policies have been pretty dominant in the US discourse in the recent years, started by President Donald Trump, but not further escalated by the Biden-Harris administration, but still they have continued many of those policies. So that is what is happening on the US side, and there is pretty much a bipartisan agreement that there shouldn't be any more market access kind of agreements with any other countries, right? And that is one of the reasons why the India-US Free Trade Agreement has been elusive. Even the Indian side is also difficult, but the US side has a more general approach to trade policy, that we won't engage any country for market access kind of agreements. So that is one thing happening on the US side. On the Indian side, some interesting things are happening. One is that we have concluded maximum number of free trade agreements in a short time in our history. So 3 agreements, that's the maximum number actually. UAE, Australia, EFTA. So these are 3 agreements that have been signed, and then many more are being negotiated. India, UK has been negotiated in full stream, and so on. So India has become a little more receptive when it comes to trade. So US becoming a little more protectionist, and India becoming a little more open. But on the other hand, at the same time, India also has increased tariffs more silently, not like the US, where there have been specific announcements and major tariff hikes, but India has been gradually increasing tariffs in the last few years on specific products and so on. So this is a broad set of issues happening in trade on both sides. And as Amitendra mentioned, there have been a lot of bilateral deals, like when Prime Minister Modi visited Washington DC last year or the year before. Actually last year. So at that time, there were a lot of deals, like some of the anti-dumping duties were reduced, some of the tariff hikes were eliminated in apples from Indian side, and some other products on the US side. So some of these disputes, which were basically going to the WTO, they have been negotiated bilaterally and resolved. And this actually is another way of the US telling the world that WTO, DSM, the dispute settlement mechanism, the appellate body, is not crucial. Countries can resolve their issues bilaterally and so on. And in a way, India kind of went with that. Although India has generally been speaking about multilateralism, engaging WTO more closely and so on. So these are all some broader set of aspects. But now I wanted to go through some numbers and some analytical aspects, and then finally I'll come back to the central question. So to begin with, we have to understand that the presidential election is crucial for sure for the US-India trade relation. But this is just a quote from CSIS. The bilateral relationship will always remain crucial, healthy and warm, irrespective of the political outcome, the election outcome. Right? So obviously certain aspects are going to be affected because of the election results. Tariffs, all of us know that if former President Trump's campaign already talks about uniform 10% tariffs, 10% higher tariffs, and so on. So that is pretty much something that we can expect to happen given the past track record of the administration. So tariffs are one aspect. Supply chain relationships are another aspect. When countries start to think in transactional terms, like Amitendra mentioned, then the supply chain relationships are hard to build. So if you like when I talk to many countries, even some of the Middle Eastern countries, when it comes to trade, now there has been greater tendency of the countries to think in terms of bilateral trade balance, as opposed to the deeper global supply chain engagements and so on. So that is a characteristic approach of the Trump administration as well, to look at the principle of mutual reciprocity. Like how much, if you have high tariffs, I'll increase the tariffs. The bilateral trade is very important. So that kind of thought process could be damaging when it comes to deeper supply chain relationships globally. And of course, technological and defense cooperation, which have been pretty strong on both administrations, but probably more with the Biden administration. So there have been two different tracks when it comes to the bilateral partnership. One part is the strategic and defense partnership, starting from the Indo-US nuclear deal and so on. And right now, India enjoys a status which all the NATO allies enjoy in terms of access to the critical technologies in the US. And of course, the economic and trade relationship is the other aspect. So, as I just mentioned, India has been designated as a major defense partner for the US, and also got this STA1 status, strategic trade authorization status. So this is with this way, India has got status that is exclusively available for the NATO allies, and there are other military agreements as well. A lot of defense cooperation is happening, and there is data sharing, there is export of sensitive US technologies and so on. So, for example, I've seen some drone companies in the US who work with US Department of Defense. Because of these new developments, they're able to develop new technologies for defense, critical technologies in the US, and then commercialize them in India. So develop them at scale, manufacture at scale in India. So I've seen many of the US R&D oriented companies which are doing this. So these things, frankly speaking, these things are happening in both administrations. This kind of relationship, but with Biden-Harris administration, they have been stronger. So now going a little bit into the numbers, I intentionally stopped. I just wanted to compare, two regimes, like some part of Obama administration and some part of Trump administration. And I didn't go beyond these years because I wanted to avoid the noise coming from COVID. So if you look at this, you see that India's exports are consistently growing, some 42 billion in 2013 to 54 billion in 2018. In terms of percentage changes also, it has been growing. The only year where it fell was in 2015, but it has been growing. So during the Trump years also, India's exports have grown a lot. India's imports also have been growing in the recent years, during the Trump years, particularly. But in the Obama years, India's imports from US have actually fallen a little bit. And in the Trump years, in 2017 and 18, there has been double-digit growth. So if you just combine the two, exports and imports, from 64 billion, it has grown to 87 billion. Just want to use a pointer. So from 64 billion to 88 billion. The only year where there was a slump was in 2015. And that was due to a variety of other reasons too, because both the exports and imports fell. And if you look at the broader trade also, both India's trade and US trade, there was a bit of a slump in that year. So there is no specific trend that we can see, although we do see some 2017 and 18 have been particularly quite positive. I mean, to single out a year, 2018 has been quite positive. 12% increase in exports of India to US and 18% increase in total trade and 29% increase in exports from US to India. Now, if you look at, yeah, it's the same. Yeah, the same thing if we try to go to a longer time horizon from 2000 to 2018, it has been consistently growing, both the goods and also services. If you also look into services, so services have been small in the beginning and they have grown quite a bit. And the growth rates have been fluctuating on and off, but generally the trend has been greater engagement between the two countries. Exports from India to US and the other way around, both are increasing. Looking at specific products in the last few years, we see major growth in gems and jewelry. That is an evergreen sector for India when it comes to exports. Aircraft, spacecraft and other parts, and minerals, fuel oil. Basically the shale revolution has led to huge increase in oil exports from US to India, particularly in 2017 and 18. You can see the trend. And other sectors, things are more stable. And if as I told you, I'm not looking at recent data, but if I just separately do that exercise, I see that I don't show it here, but I was able to see that electronics exports from India to US have increased a lot in the last few years. Not necessarily because of any regime in the US, but because of India's own policies that have promoted electronics in the recent past. So this is the trade balance. So trade balance overall, and then in terms of goods and in terms of services. One dramatic thing that has happened is India had a trade deficit in terms of services until 2005, and after that India has always had a surplus in terms of services, but in terms of goods, India always has had a surplus with the US in the last several decades. So this gives you a broad picture of what is happening in terms of trade, and it also suggests that the pre-COVID, the trade has actually expanded consistently, and even in the Trump administration, despite the tariff hikes, there has been improvement. So one logic to this could be that one reason for this happening, that despite the tariff increases, India is still exporting much more to the US than before, is the more discussed aspect of China plus one kind of situations. The tariff increases are have been done for all the partners of the US, many of the partners, steel and aluminum tariffs and so on. But particularly, some of the specific tariffs have been put against China. So there has been a tendency to reduce dependence on China and go more towards other countries. And although India has not been able to take full advantage of that, there has been some move in favor of India when it comes to the recent increases in trade with India's exports to the US. So that is the broad consideration. Now, when I look at we did a gravity model analytics, and to just give you a broad non-technical explanation of gravity model, So gravity model is a model in which we try to explain what are the determinants of trade. So just like the physical law of gravity, we say that trade or the gravitational force that we say in physics is directly proportional to mass, and mass is basically the economic mass or GDP, and inversely proportional to distance. Distance could be mostly geographical distance, but it could also be tariffs, it could also be political distance, and so on. So we look at just the India-US trade and regress it against these different variables. So what we find is that when both countries grow, the trade between the two countries is also going to grow. That is kind of very kind of logical conclusion that if India grows rapidly, India is going to import more from the US and also export more to the US, and same with the US growth. So any move towards recession in either US or in India can lead to reduction in trade. Second thing is distance, and distance has a negative effect. If 1% increase in distance happens, it may lead to 7.8% decrease in trade. So as I mentioned, distance also captures things like tariffs. So from this we can say that if tariffs are going to increase, that can have profound impact on exports from India to US. If US is going to increase tariff, which is quite a possible outcome if Mr. Trump becomes president. So this is the broad summary of what we did with the gravity model. And I have another 10 minutes. Yeah, another 10 minutes. I'll go through another analysis, a very particular focused analysis on the GSP. So the Trump administration had removed in 2019 removed India's GSP benefits, saying that there are some market access issues in India and so on. So it all started from 2018, pretty much during the early part of Trump administration, and particularly looking at limited access to India's agricultural dairy markets and price controls on medical products and so on. Although these have been discussed for a long time, but using these as a reason for eliminating or removing the GSP benefits for India was done for the first time. And we did some modeling. I don't want to get deep into the modeling technicalities, but what we did was to look at the next few years, to be precise, around 20 years, looking at next 20 years, if, let's say, the Biden-Harris administration currently, they haven't done anything to that. Trump administration had removed the GSP benefits. Revoking that action is very difficult. It's generally very difficult. But if that is done by the Biden-Harris administration going forward, or the Harris administration, that could actually lead to a lot of boost for India's exports to the US. Some of the slump that might have happened after the elimination of GSP might actually be reversed. So that's the broad conclusion we are getting here. And without getting into all the methodological aspects, what we found in our analysis was that the elimination, the reinstatement of GSP can boost exports from India, and that can actually lead to greater production and greater investment in India of the specific affected sectors. But at the same time, it's not going to make such a huge difference when it comes to the GDP impact. It's going to be just about $1 million. Sectorally speaking, in different sectors, there can be quite significant effects. But the main reason why this is not a big deal, although GSP is considered as a very important issue, whenever the Indian government engages with the US, they raise this. But in reality, it's not a big issue. After we did this modeling, we realized, because the differences between the MFN tariffs and the GSP tariffs are not very high. But if the tariffs are going to be increased, then actually GSP can become critical. So GSP can be a solace for the countries who have this GSP benefits from the overall blanket increases in tariffs by the US administration, if, for example, Trump becomes president. So from that perspective, we think that the GSP can be important in the future when the tariffs increase. But as of now, it's not that important. But going back to the other broader considerations, particularly in the last few years with the Biden-Harris administration, there has been so much focus on industrial policy in the US, revitalizing manufacturing. We have the CHIPS Act, we have Buy American, we have PILS Act that is coming up, we have infrastructure investment, Clean Energy and Climate Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, and we have this lot of R&D incentives and supply chain resilience. All these things have been happening, and in many of those things, India is a key partner. Even if you take this ISET that Amitendra was also mentioning, or IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Forum, in all of these things, there has been very deep engagement between India and the US, going beyond just trade, tariffs, all these things that we discussed before. So reshoring and domestic production. So as US does more and more reindustrialization, reshoring, India is a key partner. And this is something I've also seen while being part of Government of India. There have been a lot of inquiries from the US firms to establish their presence, develop their supplier base in India, moving away from China. How much of that is getting converted to actual investments in India? That is a tough question and still work in progress. But at least there is a lot of interest in the US to look towards India in terms of supply chain diversification, and even when the reshoring happens. Because reshoring is not going to happen completely. So they're going to specialize in some parts of the supply chain, and the other parts of the supply chain can develop in the other countries. So friendshoring may be the short-term answer to the long-term reshoring. So from that perspective, India has been deeply engaged by the US. Clean energy investments, collaborations in renewable energy technologies has been an important area. Just Energy Transition Partnership, which has been a major initiative pushed by both the US and the EU with the G7 countries together. India also has been in the discussions there along with the G7 countries. So these kind of renewable energy, net zero transition kind of approaches, India has been a partner with the US. Technological innovations, of course, there is India being an IT hub for India, for the world. That has been always on the radar when it comes to both administrations in different ways, whether it is about the H-1B visa or outsourcing. So these are all debates that happen in both administrations. R&D collaborations is something that is really a big area of future. Like I mentioned earlier, R&D, like the fundamental investments in R&D happen in the US, development of new technologies and so on. And implementation, commercialization can happen in India. So that's the kind of collaborations that are happening. But in the tech industry, there has been a little bit of competition between both countries, as I mentioned before, in terms of human resources, in terms of leveraging some of these technologies and so on. Like India is also focusing a lot on data localization. I was just talking to one of my friends in Ola. So Ola is a large company in India which is developing its own AI and generative AI and cloud infrastructure. And to begin with, they are minimizing their dependence on the US companies for cloud. So they've already eliminated the use of Microsoft and Google cloud services, and in the future they're also planning to minimize their use of other Amazon as well. So this kind of things are happening, and the government is also promoting indigenous development of this kind of cutting edge technologies. So that is another thing. So there is a little bit of competition there. Trade and tariffs I already discussed in detail, so I'm not getting into that again. Outsourcing, again I discussed about it, visa policies and so on. So one thing about this immigration debate that happens in the US in both administrations, in Biden Harris and Trump administration, is that if you look at the Indian diaspora in the US, many of them are not, like, they don't see the difference between the two approaches, the Biden approach and the Trump administration approach. I mean, one key difference is that the Trump administration, when they do something about immigration, it's mostly targeted towards the illegal immigrants. So since the Indian diaspora is largely legal immigrants, there are some illegal immigrants, but they're very small, but mostly legal. So they usually don't get so much affected by Trump's policies directly. But in some cases, there is a perception which may be justified that in the Biden-Harris administration, there is so much energy spent by the USCIS on the illegal immigrants to take care of them and so on. So that leads to a backlog in the legal immigrants, their pathways and so on. So that is one perception that the Indian diaspora has in the US. And that those perceptions also get into the India-US dialogue. So when the dialogue happens, the Indian government gets inputs from the diaspora, and then they bring this up. So that this is a quite a complicated field. There's this whole debate about illegal immigrants, outsourcing, and so on. But that's a key aspect here. Environmental standards. I think this is a very important aspect. Labor and environmental standards, both of these. The US has been, if you look at the template for any free trade agreement that US has been proposing, be it the ones that the Biden administration, Obama administration used to do before, not Biden, but Biden administration, like Korea-US trade agreement and so on, or the USMCA by Trump, these kind of deals, there is a clear specification inclusion of environmental standards and labor standards. So even in the domestic debate in the US, one of the reasons why the market access has been excluded from any trade deals in the US in the recent past is a bipartisan agreement in the Congress. And that is because there is a concern by both Democrats and Republicans that free trade has an impact on inequality. There are distributional effects of trade. For example, Senator Elizabeth Warren, she wrote a detailed note a few years ago criticizing the US ITC's analysis of various trade agreements and so on, using the models like what I was showing a few seconds ago, the GSP modeling that I did, saying that these models do not take into account the impact on things like gender equity or impact on the poorer parts of the country and so on. So there has been a broader discussion about how trade affects inequality and distributional impact and so on. Because of that, whenever they engage other countries, the US engages other countries, whether it is Trump administration or Biden administration, they have these kind of features dominating the other aspects like the traditional market access aspects and so on. So that's the one of the impediments for going forward. And then of course you have this strategic and geopolitical ties, which are going further. So I think to conclude, I would say that there are wide range of things that the Biden-Harris administration has done in the recent years, like Amit has also mentioned, in a silent way. We had to go through all this list. They were almost like academic lists. We had to go through each of them to understand what is happening. Whereas in Trump administration, I didn't have much to share because mostly it's it's all about tariffs and some discussion about this labor aspects and so on. So clearly, I think we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we have a pretty clear sense of what the impact the outcome is going to have on India-US trade. So if if Harris administration comes, probably the status quo may prevail in terms of deeper engagement between India and US, greater trade, and so on. If Trump administration comes, it's a little bit of a numbers game. So almost all countries are going to be penalized in terms of higher tariffs. How India is going to gain from it is going to depend on India's relative competitiveness after all these tariff hikes. And if Trump administration decides to do what is being talked about as the 60% tariff on China, 10% on other countries, 60% on China, then probably India can benefit more. But not necessarily in a healthy way, not necessarily in a positive way, but it can have some unintended positive consequences on India. So those are my broad thoughts in this area. I'm sure many of you may have deeper insights. So looking forward to your questions and comments and so on. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Badri. That was very insightful, and particularly the issues that have you brought up, with respect to the characters of both the administration and the Biden-Harris administration, and what might be expected from a future Trump presidency if it is to be happening. And yes, I think I'm by and large in agreement with you, because the sailing is not going to be exceptionally smooth under any specific administration, because there are going to be, I think, some imponderables which are going to arise on both sides. But having said that, this is a particular set of, I think, a transformational relationship between India and the US, because both countries are facing their own domestic challenges, and those are going to in some way impact the relationship. So I'll take questions, but before that, Badri, I just wanted to check something with you. This coming back to this question on environment, that India already, along with a large number of other countries, is kind of struggling to adjust to the fact that the carbon border adjustment mechanism will kick in on the European Union side, which is probably in just a little more than a year's time from now. The United Kingdom is also going to bring in something similar from 2027, and there are talks of several other OECD countries doing this thing. Now, there is some conversation that I have come across, and you'll be able to reflect on this better. Is there a possibility that under a Harris presidency, there might be a carbon border tax raised? Because that might be another point of concern for a lot of Indian exports. What are your thoughts on this?
Oh, thanks, Amitabh. That's a great question. And what I've been noticing in the US side, from the political debates that are happening at the senators and representatives level on both sides, is that there is kind of a consensus among the both Democrats and Republicans that these kind of mechanisms should happen. For example, there was already a discussion about green steel standards, which is pretty close to CBAM, because CBAM also one of the main sectors is steel, although there's aluminum, there is cement and other industries too. So definitely the US is thinking along these lines. I think if Harris administration comes, I think they may take the EU route. They may call it CBAM and keep it like pretty much follow a similar template. Maybe the industries may be fewer or more depending on the US sensitivities rather than the European sensitivities. If the Trump administration comes to power, they may focus more on steel. So that's why I hear a lot about this green steel kind of thoughts, because they have the US steel industry has relatively cleaner technologies compared to the developing countries. So they can leverage that to say that if you are going to export to the US, then you have to follow similar technologies.
Absolutely.
and it can be tax, it can be more, it can be a barrier. If Trump comes, it may be a barrier. If it's Harris administration, they may follow the suit. Even Australia is one of the other countries too, so they may follow.
I mean, if instead of a tariff, there are some specific standards that are mentioned. Those also can act as barriers for markets, right?
Yeah, and that would be probably stronger compared to taxes, because in taxes you're allowed to not follow the standards, and in return you're just paying those $80, $89 per ton of carbon. Whereas if you are mandated to follow the standards, then you are basically wiping out those imports.
Thank you. That's very informative again. So please go ahead and ask your questions, thoughts, comments. Yeah, please introduce yourself while asking.
Thank you. My name is Pushpa Sharma. I am researcher at ISAS. Now, following up in the same question, if those kinds of environmental standards come up in the US, that would be across the board for all the countries, right? So as you said earlier, if Trump comes into as a president and the tariffs on China are higher than on India, then India would have a competitive edge. But if these kinds of standards would kick in, what would be India's stand in terms of exports vis-a-vis China to the US? Which are the sectors that might be affected? Which are Indian sectors that might be affected, or whether India might be able to gain from it against the other country?
Yeah, I think in the context of standards, the objective of these standards is to basically eliminate imports. Like when they come up with these standards, they may set the standards in such a way that it cannot be, at least in the next few years, none of the non-OECD countries can match these standards. So if those kind of standards come in, then definitely there is very limited potential for India to take advantage of it. But if it is done in a phased way, if it is done in a way that the standards are accessible for countries like India, then India can benefit. But also looking into India, what is happening in India, like when I spoke to friends in Tata Steel and Aditya Birla Group, their steel products and so on, they're also investing in a big way in green steel, kind of like using hydrogen for steel production and so on. So they are already preparing, because the large Indian companies are already pledging to be net zero by 2030. So while the Prime Minister has promised 2070, the large Indian conglomerates have been targeting 2030. So in that sense, if you think, what I told you earlier is assuming the world, India to be static, the industries to stay where they are today, it's impossible for them to benefit from it. But if they are as dynamic as they are claiming themselves to be, maybe they can benefit from these kind of standards. Because if they really are following these standards to reduce emissions and so on, they may actually benefit from it. And this is one of the strategies some of the Southeast Asian countries have been following, particularly in terms of labor standards and so on. You adapt those standards before they are imposed on you, so that you are market ready, and then when the standards are imposed, you are going to benefit from it. So I think that is something the Indian industries are trying to follow for the first time. They have never done this before. They're always in the defensive. They say, we don't want these standards, we are not ready for it and so on. But now at least there is a talk about, because whenever I go to industry forums, they talk about decarbonization, they talk about all these environmental standards and so on. So I think to be an optimist, being an optimist, I think Indian industry can take advantage of this. But how long are they going to take? To what extent are they going to take advantage? That remains to be seen. It depends on the alignment between what they are saying and what they are doing.
Okay, then. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm an independent economist. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. So I just wanted to ask on labor migration, right? We are seeing increased news reports coming out from US that they're actually short of engineers in the semiconductor space. there are figures like they will need 50,000 more engineers in the next 5 to 6 years, and they cannot create this talent. We see Southeast Asia, Vietnam specifically coming up because it's very cheap. But also, I think India could be a big source in that sense, which also solves a problem for India in some sense because of its employment challenges that's going on. Would that not be a consideration when labor issues are considered by the next administration, whichever it is, because it actually helps with their onshoring agenda? So would migration policies might be eased in certain sectors at least?
Yeah, thanks, Priyanka. Good point. And when Prime Minister Modi came to the US recently, I was also in some of the discussions that are happening, and one of the proposals that I had was to intensify the labor exchange in healthcare sector, because we are just coming out of COVID, and US has such a huge lack of healthcare related human resources. And particularly that is one thing, like nurses and so on. The second thing is also a technology intensive part of healthcare, a combination of AI and healthcare and so on, where Indian human resources can be helpful. And there was in the final list of things that the White House published after the meeting, this was also one of the things. Like there will be an India-US collaboration in healthcare, human resources, healthcare and new technologies, human resources. So US will invest in India to develop capabilities, develop capacity so that these workforce is trained and then they are brought into the US. So this kind of ecosystem is already declared and discussed. Putting them to action is yet to be seen how it's going to be done. But again, on this, I think the Biden-Harris administration may be more proactive. Like Harris administration could be expected to be more proactive because these are some of the priority areas for them, right? When it comes to particularly those kind of jobs you're talking about, semiconductors, technology jobs, and so on, I would be a little skeptical about the Indian human resources situation, because we are also, like, even in India we have we have a lot of engineers, but very few who are skilled enough to take up this level of high-end manufacturing and so on. So India is also struggling on that. So we have this production-linked incentives for semiconductors and electronics and so on. We're making some progress, but we are still largely depending on Taiwan, and so mostly we are focusing on the assembly aspect. But again, this is the situation today, as of today, but India is also investing heavily on skill development and so on. So there could be possibilities in the future. But as it stands today, there are a lot of areas in terms of labor and migration where India can help the US, but some of the high-end areas, India still lacks capacity, I think. But things can change in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we don't know. Please.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adams Jimmy George, and I'm MSc student at NUS Business School. I have worked with Dr. Bedri as an intern during my undergrad. So my question is more on the technology vertical, especially when we are reading about the trade. Both two verticals are majorly focused, especially on policy. One is technology and pharmaceutical. Especially on technology, you pointed out that the R&D plans, so especially on the research more happening in the US and commercialization happening in India. So is there an opportunity to, on the twisting of that, more research on India? Especially, I want to follow up on that question on heavy dependence on not only US or the global economies on companies like TSMC in Taiwan of semiconductor. So what's the opportunity of India as a manufacturing hub? Especially even if the talent is not that up to the level, but what's the future in that?
Yeah, I think that the Indian government is very ambitious. They want to, promote these sectors. If you look at the whole production-linked incentives, you have a particular focus on technology-intensive sectors, right? So we want to be leaders in that. We want to boost scale, because scale was what was like. I remember Amitendu and I were discussing some 20 years ago about the failure of capital subsidies. The capital subsidies led to just people would just buy machineries because they're getting subsidies, and then they'll sell those machineries. They won't produce anything. So we were discussing about this production-related subsidies 20 years ago, and it has happened now. So that way, the focus is scale. So once there is scale, then there is going to be enough resources for R&D and so on. Because when you don't have scale, then you cannot think of anything. Because the whole growth of Chinese economy was based on that. Right? Initially, they focused on scale, and then once scale was there, now nobody thinks of China as a low labor cost economy. We think of it as a high-tech economy. And that happened over time with the scale, with greater investments in R&D and so on. So definitely India has to have that ambition, like Priyanka also mentioned, and they're doing taking some steps in that direction. But I think we should be much more aggressive. So we're not that aggressive, is what I'm saying. So we're already kind of slow. We're losing the race. So India has to do much more in terms of being a R&D hub. So to begin with, we have to increase our R&D expenditure as a share of GDP, as a share of output. Even that is very small now. So.
Thank you for your talk. I'm Divya. I'm a research associate at the institute. My question is on the tariff part and relating it to the gravity model. So the distance there you said stands for the tariffs or a proxy for a tariff here, right? So we've seen that despite the tariffs being applied onto Chinese products, we're reading reports that it's gaining backdoor entry. So does your model take that into account? Also in general, so what do you think will be the reaction of the administrations, just be it the Biden-Harris administration or the Trump administration, to tackling this?
Yeah, great question. In terms of the model itself, this is taken into account by looking at the empirical data. You'll see that you capture the bilateral relationships. You see China exporting to US, Mexico also exporting to US. You'll see that Mexico exports to US is increasing. But then if you also see exports from China to Mexico, that is also increasing. So the import content of exports, if you go to that level, when you look at the global value chain level, then the model captures this, right? But the model, most of the models that we have are a little older, right? Like I show the data that I showed is older data. Whatever we are saying is happening right now. I know a lot of Chinese investors who are going to Mexico, investing there, and supplying some intermediate inputs from China to there, and then adding value, and then supplying to the US. With the USMCA agreement, there are some rules of origin requirements, and they're really smart. They make sure that those requirements are met, but still, they get a lot of leverage from China. So that is happening, and I know some companies, when they approached the Indian government when I was there, some of the US companies came because two things happened. One is the Chinese suppliers would be willing to relocate to Southeast Asian countries so that the American companies can be assured of the same quality, same kind of timeliness of getting all their supplies. But there was pushback from the Biden administration to also minimize such instances. That is why they were coming to India. They say if we come to India, then the Chinese suppliers are not going to set up plant in India. That is not possible given the FDA restrictions that India has come up with, that Chinese investments cannot directly be routed to India. It has to go through some process. That's a separate topic I can discuss, where even many Indian companies, even some public sector enterprises are suffering because of that. But that's just another topic for another day. But what I'm saying is the reason why some of the US companies who want to be very tightly aligned with the US policies, in spirit, not in actual requirements, those are the ones who are really trying to establish some presence in India and other countries which have limited interaction with China, which is not many other countries. So it's mostly India. So that's the thing. So there is apart from the regulatory aspect, like tariffs and so on, there is also this kind of signaling happening from the administration that at some point we'll do something about it. We are not doing anything today, but maybe at some point we are going to do something about it. So be careful. Don't try to take the shortcuts. So that's the message that the US administration is giving to the industry. And yes, and they are getting, some of the companies are getting the message and trying to diversify their portfolio risks and so on. But some of them are saying like until they do that, let's continue this. Right? So definitely that's how it has been managed. The way Mexico rose as the number one trade partner to the US, overtaking China. If you see the composition, it's all driven by China, basically. So, thanks.
More questions, anybody? If not, Badri, I wanted to just bring you up onto one particular issue which I think is again becoming a serious issue both from a political side as well as a economic side. And this is just talking about the electric vehicles. So electric vehicles we have seen, I mean, they've turned out to be the latest tool for political expression making, if one can express it that way. That after the United States and the European Union pushed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, now Canadians have also announced their intention. Now, what does this basically mean for for a country like India? Because the way I'm looking at it is that if this is a policy that the United States or its partners continue to take, then in some respects there can be benefits for certain countries. I'm not sure if India is a part of that, but there could well be benefits. And because the Chinese EV makers are going to make all efforts to access the European Union market, the American market, the Canadian market, and they would want to shift to those countries from where they can export up close. Do you think there's a possibility India might, in that sense, benefit from Chinese investments? I mean, there's a possibility that India might, since you have been engaging with the government, there's a possibility that India might have a rethink on Chinese investments.
Yeah, on this, the first thing is when these tariffs were announced, we did also some analytics on that and also talking to some other governments also about this. For example, the Saudi Arabian government, they recently had signed a deal with the Chinese to relocate some of those EV manufacturers to Saudi Arabia. Because Saudi Vision 2030, they have some grand plans for automotive industry, including electric vehicles. And right now they don't exist, so they want to kickstart the development of the industry. And they got this deal with the Chinese manufacturers. Very recently it came in the news. So that's one example. And when it comes to India, India has pretty vibrant electric vehicles industry last few years. Tata itself has a big electric vehicles offerings, and Ola is becoming a big player now. And every other auto majors, they have their own electric vehicles in India now. And they also are very ambitious. Many of the Indian electric vehicle manufacturers are very ambitious. Like I spoke to Ola, I spoke to others. They want to access the European and the US markets by themselves. And definitely there is a buzz about Chinese investments, benefiting Indian ecosystem. Given this, the way I explained about how Saudi Arabia is taking advantage of that. But from an economic perspective, yes, I think it would be great opportunity for India to engage more with China and get all those investments and so on. But from political perspective, we all know that it's difficult. So anything to do with Chinese investments in India is going to be tricky for the foreseeable future, despite a statement in the economic survey recently about this particular thing, where there was a talk about getting Chinese investments in India. But that is, it's going to be very difficult unless, because as I mentioned, even the public sector enterprises are getting affected by this kind of embargo with China. So, I don't think this situation is going to change very quickly. But I agree with you that it could be a win-win for both India and China if those investments come to India, and China can use India as a hub for electric vehicle manufacturers and exports, which is a very unusual thing. Like, we could have never thought about it in the past, but that there is an opportunity for that, purely from economic policy thinking.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, what I'll do is that we will conclude a little early, because today apparently happens to be something called Eat with Your Family Day. I know you're not here with your family, but one of the outcomes of that Eat with Your Family Day, as followed by a university, is that the staff leave early today.
Okay.
So, but not that early. We are not going to throw you out. So what we will do is that we will just end a few minutes before the talk was supposed to end at 4:15. So, Badri, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And it's been very useful, very enlightening, and please keep in touch.
Thank you. Definitely.
Come back to Singapore soon again. Singapore and Seattle are not very far away. So
Yeah, pretty close. Yeah.
by the gravity model, the distance factor needs to be considered. So choose Singapore as your transit.
Yeah, absolutely.
As often as you can while going to India and other places. And lovely seeing you again. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Have a good weekend. Thank you. Come, we'll have coffee.
Yeah, sure. So I want to introduce you to my friend actually. You know, right? Yeah.